Never in my life did I think I would utter the phrase, Blade kills the Marvel Universe, but that's what he's doing. He's killing everybody. So what this does is this initially opens up with a handful of different villains, if we want to call it that, suddenly transforming, manifesting, and changing. This list is basically Darkstar, Dusk, Silhouette, Cloak, all these different people who use Darkforce energy. Now, for those of you guys who are not familiar with Darkforce energy in Marvel Comics, it hails from the Darkforce dimension. It's literally just pure darkness is all it is, right? So it's like black ink basically flowing into the Marvel Universe. The reason why that matters is because what it's doing is it's encasing the Earth and blocking out the sun. But there's no rhyme or reason for why these guys are doing it. They just start doing it indiscriminately. Now, with the Avengers responding as best they can, of course, Iron Man talks to Scarlet Witch and is like, can you use your magic to fix this? This is one of those instances where the Scarlet Witch's power is relative to whoever's writing the story. Because if this was like Scarlet Witch in House of M, she would just be like, sure, snap her fingers and fix the problem, and that's basically it. Instead, her power is drastically reduced compared to where it was before, because, not to be cynical, but that's what the story calls for. And so the result is that she can't really do anything to fix this. More so than that, the way that it's explained is it's like trying to keep an ocean from pouring into Earth through these different kind of portals, which is basically what these guys have turned into. Now from there, what you do is you jump over to the Midnight Mission. And this requires a little bit of explanation, because for those of you guys who didn't see our videos covering Moon Knight, which I highly suggest you watch, Jed McKay's run was fantastic, and he's actually the guy writing this story right now. Mark Spector, Moon Knight formed the Midnight Mission as a kind of group where basically they would just help out individuals who needed them. Coincidentally, and we'll talk about that later on in this video, there was a particular thing that happened in the Moon Knight run that actually rolls over here, and is one of the reasons why all this stuff is happening. But one of the guys you get here is Hunter's Moon. He's kind of like the replacement for Moon Knight, but not really, because Moon Knight's kind of back, but not really. He's sort of dead, but he's alive at the same time. It's weird, just don't worry about that. Just know that's why you see the Midnight Mission, but you don't really see Moon Knight per se. But much like what they've been dealing with before, vampires are showing up. So they don't really see it as like a major, huge issue outside or beyond anything they've seen before. But where things really start to go sideways is that all around the world, because this Darkforce energy is encasing the Earth itself, in Milan, Italy, in Lagos, Nigeria, in Calgary, Canada, that all these vampires are all just emerging out of the darkness and attacking every single person they see. So what you're looking at here is a full-on war between the vampires and Earth. Don't worry, we'll get to Blade here in a second. One of the other things that happens is Dr. Doom basically starts activating all these fortifications around Latveria in order to keep Latveria safe from all the different vampires that are out there. And it's a combination of technology and magic. So using things like ultraviolet lights combined with just magical protections, because a lot of people who do not read comics do not know that Dr. Doom is one of the most powerful practitioners of magic in the entirety of the Marvel Universe. But this is when Blade starts to come into play, because one of the people who responds to what's going on is Miles Morales. And Miles, of course, being young and fun and that kind of thing, is like, okay, so vampires, like, what would Blade do here? And Blade chimes in and he says, that's a good question. Things are looking bad, Spider-Man, but I've got a plan. And it's not just down to what I do, I've got something I need you to do. Now, here's the thing. Blade showing up to Miles Morales is not arbitrary here. The reason why I say that is because Blade has a daughter. Her name is Bloodline, and really her actual name is Brielle. But what ended up happening is there was a crossover between Miles Morales and Blade, where Miles, Brielle, and Blade himself actually ended up just kind of dealing with some vampires. And so while it wasn't enough to like train Miles in the art precisely of how to cope with vampires, it was enough to give him like some arms and armament to know how to cope with this sort of thing. Plus it was Marvel kind of teasing the idea that there might be some romantic potential between Blade's daughter and Miles Morales. And if I'm a betting man, if I'm Miles, I ain't hooking my horse to that carriage, right? You understand what I'm saying, right? Like it's just, I would never do that in my life. But of course, the Avengers are responding to all of this as well. One of the things that I do want to point out here is that because of everything that's happened in Marvel Comics up to this point, including like the fall of the House of X and all that kind of stuff, this takes place immediately after that. Like within a day or so of that happening. Marvel specifically laid that out in saying that the Avengers haven't really had a chance to regroup after like their massive battle. And so that's why even going into this fight, they all kind of feel exhausted. But one of the things that happens here is Sam Wilson, in observing all of this alongside the Vision and Wanda, is that Vision says, I've accessed what information sources I can. Dracula is currently unaccounted for. And the response to Sam Wilson is, that makes sense. This does not feel like Dracula. After all, the work he put into founding his vampire nation, he pulls something like this. It's outside of his trajectory. Again, we'll make sense of that as we get further into the video, but they're all kind of asking the question, then who? Who's uniting all these vampires across the world to attack the superheroes? And that's when Blade chimes in, right? He's like, this is Blade, I'm on the run and have information, we need to meet. Log onto my coordinates and teleport this rig up to the Impossible City. Meet me there, Blade out. Right now, the Impossible City is the current headquarters of the Avengers in Marvel Comics, but of course, the Avengers respond, right? They break away, they travel to Impossible City, but they're not too keen about it because while they're up there and teleporting this ship, everything is going nuts down there on Earth, but everything's about to go nuts here too, because as soon as this truck shows up, this immediate like screeching sound starts happening to everybody and no one can hear what's going on. And then just like these crazy looking vampire guys emerge from out of nowhere, and they're basically like a brood, a coming together of these vampires that are actually from a different dimension. Again, we'll go through Bloodhunt more in future videos. We'll probably do it every Friday, right? And then just kind of explain all this stuff as time goes on. But what you end up learning is that by whatever manner and whatever means, these differing guys all have different kinds of powers. But as vampires, their core base is that they feed. But instead of just feeding on blood, they feed on superheroes and they feed on different types of powers. So one of them feeds on magic, another one feeds on thoughts, different things along those lines. They're a really, really adept and capable team. And when I say adept and capable, I mean, these guys crush the Avengers. It's not even close, right? It's just absolutely insane. None of them have any real chance to take these guys out. Sam Wilson's taken out immediately because, of course, you know, he's Sam Wilson. He's basically Captain America with nothing that makes Captain America Captain America. So he has like no super soldier serum. He can kind of fly, but like that's basically it. Vision's taken out using technology. Iron Man's entire armor is shut down. Thor's overpowered through sheer force and strength. Each one of these guys are neutralized with the greatest of ease. And so what goes on here is that in this moment, when they realize that they're all basically being overpowered, one of the things they're told is, we're not here to kill the Avengers. We're here to turn the Avengers, to turn you into us. And one of the characters they're going after is specifically Sam Wilson, because even though Sam Wilson is or isn't Captain America, depending on how you view Captain America in comic books, the fact is the concept of Captain America is symbolic, right? As we know, every July 3rd, you and myself and everybody else, we lay out milk and cookies for Captain America, right? So that he can bring us freedom on July 4th. That's the thing that we do, guys. It's the thing we do here in America, for those of you guys who don't live in America. But the fact is, in all seriousness, he's a symbol to people. And so with the fall of Captain America comes the fall of America. That's what it symbolically represents. And so having him turn to their side will basically dishearten and demoralize any opposition that goes on out there from both the superhero community and the non-superhero community. And so with all these guys being defeated, Thor being taken out as well, Black Panther launches this last-ditch attack, which is not really designed to defeat these guys. Instead, it's designed to give them a way out, right? It's designed for them to evacuate as an emergency. Now, he also tells Sam Wilson, right, like, you can't fall because you're a symbol. The world's going to need a symbol. That's kind of the core of Captain America, right? That's one of the reasons why Captain America is so significant, is because, is he the most powerful character ever? I mean, not really, right? Like, the Incredible Hulk could beat Captain America to death on his weakest day. You know what I mean? Like, there's any number of characters that could crush Captain America. It's what he stands for within the superhero community and the world as a whole. And so what it does is it allows basically all the other Avengers to teleport out outside of Black Panther. And so what you do is you jump to Doctor Strange. And this is where things get cool, because what ends up happening is Stephen Strange and Clea, right? Clea being the on again, off again wife slash love interest of Doctor Strange. The two of them are back together yet again. That what ends up happening here is they're looking over all these different spells, these different just magical incantations they can use in order to find a way to defeat the vampires. Because one of the coolest things about vampires in Marvel, and you wouldn't really know this unless you read things like Midnight Suns, Doctor Strange's Secret Avengers from the 90s, anything related to Blade, right back in the 90s, that vampires are this really interesting concept in Marvel because they're innocent people who have been turned. And so on one hand, various people outside of Blade just kills any vampire he comes across, but outside of him, various people are trying to find a way to turn these turned humans back into normal humans. And on the other hand, it's like trying to keep the vampire forces at bay. And by and large, they just kind of stay in their corner over there, popping their heads out every once in a while, wreaking a little bit of havoc, but a full-on assault like this is kind of unheard of. And so all these different spells that are being developed here, you have this conversation between Blade and Stephen, where Blade says a spell to kill every vampire on Earth. That's a good trick, Doc, but you need the Darkhold for that, don't you? And last I heard, Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch, destroyed it. And so they kind of greet Blade as a friend, because while Blade has always sort of been an outlier in Marvel Comics, just out there doing his own thing against vampires, in more recent years, he became a part of the Avengers. And even though he was still kind of just the dude over there skulking in the shadows, he was a part of the team. And over and over and over again, he always demonstrated himself as a relatively valuable member of the team, depending on what kind of mission they were dealing with. And so when they greet him that way, Stephen Strange says, "It's good to see you, old friend, and especially so on a day like today. What's happening?" And what Blade says is a vampire uprising, but you knew that. We've all tangled with vampires before, but this is different. This time they're organized, one big push to break humanity, put the blood drinkers on top. They call themselves the Structure, a vampire cult that was spreading across the world before Moon Knight killed their leader, but they found a new leader, one with a plan. Now, sidetrack here for a second, let's talk about Moon Knight. So in the Moon Knight run from Jed MacKay that we covered, and that's why I said we'd come back and talk about this, over the course of the first half of the Moon Knight run, there were all these vampires taking pot shots right here and there, and that's how you got members of Moon Knight's team like Reese and so on and so forth. What ended up happening is they tracked down their leader in what was in effect like a ballroom. No joke, these vampires were meeting in like a Holiday Inn Express. Not even lying to you guys, but they were in this ballroom, they were all having this meeting, and they were talking about how they were going to basically rise up, destroy humanity. Moon Knight ends up killing this guy and all the other vampires through a combination of sheer strength, as well as having one of his guys activate the sprinkler system and then consecrating the sprinkler water and turning it into holy water. It was dope. Yes, I know Deadpool did it first. It doesn't take away from how awesome that moment was. And so following that, the Structure was just seemingly aimless, but like somebody had taken it over. And so what Blade says is the plan is threefold. Number one, using Atlantean rituals to detonate Darkforce users and turn them into portals to block out the sun. Number two, global uprisings, mobilizing legions of mass-turned maniacs all across the globe, striking at population centers, critical infrastructure, and the like. Number three, take out the Avengers. The X-Men, nobody really needs to worry about because they're not even organized anymore. Krakoa's gone, right? So they're just kind of flying by the seat of their pants. Who knows how things are going to transpire with them? And so where Doctor Strange and Clea hear this, it's just like, dude, what in the world is going on here? Like, who's taking out the Avengers? And that's when Blade says a kill squad. Ultra vampires fed on superhuman blood, empowered by divergent philosophies, or feeding on pain or ghosts or magic. The Blood Coven is a match for the Avengers, believe me, or at least they were. This is not conjecture, the Avengers are down. And so that's when Stephen and Clea are like, then it's more important than ever that we assemble the formula with what grimoires we do have. And so that's when Blade's kind of like, you would do that. You would kill every vampire on Earth. Some of them are on your side, aren't they? Kind of referring to himself. And the response of Stephen, if it means wiping out vampires who are friends, I will do that if it means destroying all the vampires on Earth. So Stephen Strange is like, I mean, I get you're on our side, man, but you just may be collateral damage. I don't know what to tell you. And Blade doesn't attack him. Instead, he's just kind of like, that's impressive, man. That's actually impressive, right? I already knew that Wanda Maximoff would never cast the spell to exterminate an entire people. It's simply not in her. But you, I was not sure of. And so it's really cool because Stephen Strange goes back to work and he starts asking kind of aimlessly, you mentioned a new leader for this structure. Who is this mastermind? Is it Dracula? And the response of Blade is, no, it's nothing like that, right? Like, do you want to know who put out the sun, who released the children of the night, who assembled the monsters, who killed the Avengers, the leader of the structure? It's me. And like, he kills Doctor Strange on the spot, just like impales this guy, because Blade officially starts killing everybody in the Marvel Universe. Now, the question has to be asked here, why? Why is Blade doing this? Okay, so here's the cool thing. In the months and arguably years that have been leading up to Bloodhunt so far, Marvel's released several stories and events that have just kind of laid the groundwork for all of this. Of course, we talked about the structure, that Blade is now the leader of the structure. As far as the larger vampire nation itself, for years and years in Marvel Comics, the Vampire Nation was less of a nation and more just a series of tribes, for lack of a better word, that existed around the world. Dracula was kind of like the unofficial leader in the sense that he was seemingly the oldest and resided above them all, but that was about it, right? He was more of like the symbolic leader of the Vampire Nation than anything else. But in the Blade series and the Vampire Nation one-shot that came out as a kind of a prelude to Bloodhunt, what Dracula had done is he had unified the entirety of the Vampire Nation under one single ideology, bringing everybody together. But that was where the issue of the structure came in, that the structure were just kind of like radicals within the Vampire Nation itself, right? They were not that dissimilar from like those members in Wakanda that were nationalists and then overthrew T'Challa in Storm and then cast them out of Wakanda. Any kind of ground roots movement that seeks to overthrow the established order and replace it with their own and their own ideologies. And so Dracula ultimately lost control of the Vampire Nation essentially. And the idea is that Blade is the one that can actually lead the Vampire Nation into taking over the world. But the question is, why is Blade himself the one who's doing this? Within the Avengers comics, one of the things that had happened was because the Vampire Nation became its own sovereign nation, that Blade was appointed by the United Nations as a kind of like sheriff to basically make sure that the Vampire Nation itself didn't extend beyond its borders and didn't do exactly this, launch some attack against the world. Because the fear of the various governments of the world was that with the Vampire Nation consolidating themselves into a single territory, that much like the X-Men in Krakoa, that the vampires were building an army, right? So Blade was kind of the one to report back and different things along those lines. But in Blade Volume 5, issue number 2, Blade ended up coming across this kind of demon entity named Adana. And what ended up happening is Blade inadvertently freed Adana by being manipulated. The only way for Blade to seemingly defeat Adana was to consume some of Dracula's blood, which amplified his powers and his abilities. The problem is that it seems to have driven him crazy. We don't know the full totality of how it's affected him, but Blade as a character kind of has a complicated history in that way. Originally, he was just a vampire, and that was it. Then he was bitten by Michael Morbius, and that gave him the ability to become the Daywalker. So who knows how consuming the pure blood of Dracula would affect him, and seemingly it's driven him nuts, and that's why he's somehow corrupted. So again, we don't know everything that's going on at the time that I'm recording this video, but pretty soon we will. So what this does is this opens up with actually kind of a flashback from the Miles Morales tie-in for the Bloodhunt event. And what we talked about in the previous video that we did, which we'll link a playlist to it at the end of this, is Blade effectively made a move against the world where he took over the Vampire Nation and then used a variety of superpowered beings to essentially block out the sun, which gave normal vampires the ability to run amok on Earth. But before all of it started, he went and met with Miles, but we never actually found out what happened. Instead, Miles just kind of popped back up on the scene, and we'll cover the rest of that over the course of this video. But this flashback tells us that initially Miles fighting all these different vampires out here before the world kind of goes dark is he thinks one of them belongs to Ramir. Now, Ramir is a guy out there who uses basically energy vampires, and that's one of the things to know in Marvel Comics. There's all kinds of different vampires. You have your vampires that are traditional, so like they just suck on blood and they run around in the middle of the night and put a stake through their chest and like they're donezo. But then you also have characters like Celine, who is a mutant that's immortal, but she's also an energy vampire, meaning she siphons the life energies out of people. Michael Morbius and so on and so forth. The list goes on and on and on. And so when Blade hears this from Miles, he tells them these vampires that are out there are not the kind of vampires you're thinking of. And he says, but before I tell you what's going on, I have to change your perspective. And that's when Blade bites Miles Morales. Now, following that, a fight between the two of them breaks out, and Miles actually holds his own, which is a pretty impressive feat, because for those of you guys who are not familiar with the character of Blade, he actually came across Wolverine at one point in time. And while Wolverine didn't necessarily train Blade to the full extent of everything he knew, he did to a degree. Combine that with just the various forms of fighting that Blade has learned over the years, and he is prodigious. So much so that he's every bit as capable as guys like Captain America. In fact, I'd be curious to see what a knockdown, drag-out fight between like Steve Rogers and Blade would look like. But I say that to say, Blade is more than enough to hold his own against any traditional fighter in the Marvel Universe, not even taking into account his increased speed and strength and all that kind of stuff. And so Miles being able to hold it is really, really solid, because the first thing that happens here, of course, is Blade basically just grabs him and like sends him flying, right? More like a distraction than anything else. But because of Miles' enhanced abilities, as well as the time that he spent working alongside Peter Parker leading up to Secret Wars in the Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2 storyline from Brian Michael Bendis, and when he was brought into the main Marvel Universe after Secret Wars and the time that he's been here, he's very, very capable, right? So like one of the things he learned from Peter Parker is that fighting a Spider-Man is more than just cracking jokes, right? Peter Parker does that in order to throw his enemies off guard. We learned that from the Spider-Man Renew Your Vows storyline by Dan Slott. But when it came to fighting beyond that, it was also throwing them off guard by messing with their senses, moving so fast that it's difficult for them to keep up with. But with Blade, it doesn't work that way. That because Blade is so capable and Blade is so powerful, that he literally catches Miles almost every step of the way. But that's where things start to go awry, because when Miles goes for this attack with his Venom Blast, which should be enough to throw Blade off kilter or at the very least subdue him, because Miles was bitten by Blade, Miles is now a servant of Blade. And that's when Blade is able to stop Miles from what he's doing, right? Literally stop Miles from fighting. And that's why he says, close kid, but looks like that bite's finally taken hold. Vampirism is working its way through your system. I made you, which means I control you. Now let's put that energy to better use, kid, because after all, you're now a fellow creature of the night, and I have need of you yet. And that's when Miles says yes, and just does what Blade tells him to. Now, what this does is this jumps back to basically the, I guess, follow-up to the ending of the last video that we did, which is Bloodhunt Part 2. Because with Blade and his forces basically taking out the Avengers, which he did, right? Like took out the Avengers pretty much by himself, that now he has them all held captive, or at least enough of them, right? He's got Thor, he's got the Scarlet Witch, and he's got Black Panther. Black Panther's particularly important because there's something within Wakanda that Blade is hunting for. But following that, he sends his forces kind of back out there into the world to basically round up whoever's next, but to also chase after Brielle. Now, Brielle is a character that we mentioned in the previous video that we did, and I kind of wanted to wait until now to really provide some clarity here. But Brielle Brooks is the daughter of Blade. She also goes by the name Bloodline. She was introduced in the actual Bloodline Daughter of Blade comic, and the way this played out is that in essence, Blade's wife, girlfriend, however you want to look at it from the old Tomb of Dracula stories, but the long and short of this is that Blade's daughter was born without any indication that she was a vampire. She hadn't inherited any of her father's powers or anything like that. And so the way it was explained in the story is that Blade had traveled to meet Doctor Strange, and really as a request, Doctor Strange had done with Brielle what he did with Peter Parker in Brand New Day, or what is it? Whatever the follow-up was to One More Day, where basically Doctor Strange wipes everybody's knowledge of Peter Parker's identity. That the same thing happens here, that he wipes the world's knowledge of really Brielle. More so than that, it's more like she cannot be detected through magic or anything along those lines, but it more or less serves the same purpose. What this did is it allowed Blade and his wife and his daughter to live some semblance of a normal life. But more recently, what Marvel had done is they had launched a story where Stephen Strange had died. It was literally the death of Doctor Strange. That allowed Clea to take over the role in his place. But with his death also came the deactivation of the spell, which means now everybody became aware of Brielle. And for the most part, it really just sort of led to Blade going and grabbing his daughter and then teaching her what she needed to know once her powers started to manifest, because he realized that given how capable she was and the fact that she was his daughter, people would come for her for any number of reasons. And so it was just kind of an end run way for Marvel to introduce a backstory that made some semblance of sense and then go forward from there. But that's where you also find out that Dracula, who had previously been the leader of the Vampire Nation, is kind of on the run now, right? That's what we learned in the first video, was that Blade has essentially taken over all the vampires across the world, because with Dracula, it was more of, we are vampires, we kind of have to play our part, right? Sitting in the darkness and running around at night and all that kind of good stuff. The Blade was more like, no, like we're going to conquer everything and we're going to rule the world. Now, Blade, as you see him here, is not really Blade, and we'll clarify that as we get further into it. It's not really him acting of his own faculties, which most people figured out within the first video that we did. But the fact is, Dracula is now hunting for Brielle because he realizes she's really the only person that can take the fight to Blade and essentially solve this. What's ironic is Brielle doesn't know her father is behind all of this. So it is really cool, right? It is really interesting, and she does find out. But what you end up doing is switching over to Miles Morales. And Miles actually ends up meeting up with Tigra and Hunter's Moon, who of course are now kind of the leaders of the Midnight Mission after the death of Moon Knight in Marvel Comics. And so because of that, they all decide to go see Doctor Strange. But the reason why they do this is because when it comes to vampires in Marvel Comics, and really just the monster side of things, that's really just the Midnight Sun side of Marvel, truth to tell, right? Ghost Rider, Blade, all that kind of stuff. And Doctor Strange to a degree. It's really been a Doctor Strange thing since the 1990s and like the formation of the Midnight Suns, Doctor Strange's Secret Defenders, that kind of thing. But it makes the most sense. The problem here is, as we saw in the last video, Doctor Strange was attacked by Blade and he was bitten and turned into a vampire. The beauty of this, and because of the nature of Stephen Strange being there with his wife Clea, what they're able to do is pull his spiritual form from his physical body. So his physical body is just running around like a vampire doing crazy vampire things and trying to tear up the whole house. But Doctor Strange himself can just appear as like a non-corporeal form. So it is interesting, right? It's a cool way to keep Doctor Strange in the story. It happens all the time. For those of you guys who are unfamiliar with Doctor Strange, like every time you crack open a book, his body is somehow destroyed and he just turns into a spirit and roams around for a while. But following that, the Avengers end up arriving on the scene, not to Doctor Strange proper, but basically to like Blade's blood coven, right? Which is kind of like Blade's anti-Avengers team, essentially. The whole reason why this fight takes place is to really just kind of give the Avengers some semblance of being able to marshal their forces, regather, and jump back out into the fight. Because again, like they were dominated with a quickness, right? As soon as Blade's forces showed up on the scene, the Avengers were taken out like that. One thing that I do want to point out is you do not see Steve Rogers here. He is in a tie-in for the main Avengers comic. He's not doing anything meaningful. He's fighting against Baron Blood. It's kind of a pointless story, which is sort of disappointing. This is one of those instances, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with comics, where Marvel is focusing more on Sam Wilson being Captain America than Steve Rogers because of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So that's why you see Sam Wilson here as Captain America instead of Steve Rogers. But basically, like, the Avengers are able to hold their own against these guys. Because one of the things to know is that you have one member of the Blood Coven that's snatched up by Vision. And one of these guys, right, this particular member is able to manipulate people's brain patterns. And while Vision is technically an android, his brain powers are based on Wonder Man's Simon Williams. So he's not that far removed from a human. The benefit of Vision is he can literally cycle his brain patterns at such a frequency that they just can't be locked onto, right? So it's like modulating shields so that nobody can ever actually break through those shields. But Vision ultimately cycles his brain patterns and ultimately just can't be locked onto. And so as a result of that, he's able to take one member of the Blood crew and fly them up into the sky. Now, this is where things are a little wonky. And the reason why I say that is because for those of you guys who read Secret Empire, where Captain America Steve Rogers was a Hydra agent and basically took over North America, one of the things they did is Steve Rogers used Darkforce energy to encapsulate the entirety of New York and move New York into the Darkforce dimension, basically a dimension of pure darkness. But Darkforce energy in Marvel Comics has been established in such a way to where there's no true means of escaping it. Instead, what's happening in this story is the role and the purpose of Darkforce energy is modified to where it's not that dissimilar from like Operation Dark Storm in the Matrix, where they block out the sun. That's effectively what happens here. So it's a change in how Darkforce energy is used. Not to say that it's right or wrong, but for those of you guys who are looking for some continuity between like older stories and this stories, it's one of those things where Marvel just kind of shifts it up. But the bigger point is one of these vampires is taken above the sky, they're exposed to the sun, and then of course they die the way that you would expect them to. And it just kind of gives the Avengers the upper hand, right? Like it rallies them and it's like, okay, cool, we've got a solid shot. And then at that point, you switch back to Miles Morales. And so Miles joining like Iron Man, Sam Wilson, the rest of the Avengers who have now arrived on the scene, that the whole idea is they're gonna split up into groups. The issue with this is that immediately Miles activates as a vampire because that was the role that he was supposed to play. That he was sent in by Blade as essentially a Trojan horse. When all the superheroes gather together in one place, Miles can activate and Miles can attack. And it's an incredibly smart maneuver by Blade, because had it not been for Doctor Strange and Clea, it would have worked. Everybody would have died, because it shows how capable Miles is. Now, the only reason Blade knows this, for those of you guys who have not been tracking Miles comics, is there was a point where Miles and Blade's daughter teamed up against some vampires. So Blade learned very, very fast how capable Miles Morales is. And as the guy that nobody suspects, he's the perfect Trojan horse. And so again, like as soon as this guy makes his move and starts attacking everybody, immediately Clea activates the Crimson Bands of Sidorak, which are enough to restrict Miles Morales. And then in turn, he's literally just like blasted with energy by Doctor Strange in a kind of spell, right? The Eye of Agamotto shows Miles the truth. And while it's not enough to cure him of his vampirism, it is enough to seemingly temporarily remove the effects of Blade controlling him, which brings him back to his normal self. And that's when Brielle is given the information that her father is the one behind all of this. Now, here's one of the interesting things here, is in a lot of ways it feels like with that revelation, the story is now less about Blade and more about his daughter. And I would say that as time goes on, that perspective will shift. Why? I'm not entirely sure. If I'm a betting man, I would say that like we're gonna learn that Wesley Snipes' Blade has a daughter in like the MCU because he's supposed to appear in the multiverse at some point in time. So I don't know how all that's gonna go down, right? No real indication there. Of course, we know that he was banging that one chick who was super hot back in the first Blade movie. I'm sorry, sweetheart, I love you to death. But it is one of those crazy moments, right? It is one of those cool little tidbits that we may end up getting. The important thing is that it's really more just the fact that so much pressure is put on her because now she's gonna have to be the one to track her father down and kill her father, right? So it's like the whole Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader type thing from Star Wars. You can see a lot of like pop culture themes are being rolled into this particular story in a variety of different ways. But at the end of the day, what ends up happening is the groups basically start splitting off with each other and going after different facets of the vampire community in different ways, seeking out magical enchantments that can overcome the effects of Blade, seeking out ways to attack Blade directly. But more so than that, what the Avengers really intend to do is to kind of reassure the world. And I know it's sort of a lackluster statement, but the way that it happens is pretty dope, right? So when it comes to Sam Wilson's character as Captain America in Marvel Comics, yes, there was a lot of backlash from Rick Remender's run with the transition from Steve to Sam Wilson. I didn't really care, didn't really matter to me, because honestly, Captain America never really mattered to me that much. But within the comics themselves, that sort of real world backlash was recognized in the comic, where there was literally a comic book run called Not My Captain, which is what a lot of people were saying out there in the real world. But the fact is that Sam Wilson was never really welcomed as the new Captain America by just like the country as a whole, right? That they always saw just Steve Rogers as the only Captain America that was out there. And so he makes this kind of impassioned speech that spreads across the world, right? From like Halifax to the Impossible City, which used to be the Avengers headquarters and is now taken over by Blade, Manhattan, Mexico City, even within the confines of Asgard, where basically Moon Knight's team is, Latveria, Wakanda, where Black Panther is currently residing, kind of hiding away from everything. It's this big speech where in essence, Sam Wilson basically basically tells the world, we have faced multiple threats over and over and over again. We've faced off Null, the symbiote god. We've faced off against Galactus. We've done all these things, right? And every single time we rallied together and we always came out on top. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. It's a pretty rousing speech. I mean, it's not the greatest thing ever, right? You know, again, it's just kind of Marvel looking to sort of keep the profile of Sam Wilson high, given the fact that he's got his own movie coming out next year. But the thing here is that what they're really looking for and what's really important is T'Challa the Black Panther, because what Blade has been hunting for most of this time is an artifact, and it's an artifact that existed within Wakanda since the fall of old Atlantis. Now, to sidetrack here for a second, this is a really cool bit of history in Marvel Comics, right? So just kind of bear with me. You'll find it pretty fascinating. Of course, as most people who read Marvel Comics know, you've got Namor the Submariner and you have Atlantis. At one point in time, Atlantis was literally an island out there in the Atlantic Ocean. What ended up happening is that when the Celestials initially showed up on Earth and they basically created the Eternals and the Deviants, they left, right? That initial creation was called the First Host. They also planted the genes for mutants at some point in time. Once they came back with the second host, the Deviants, who had basically taken over the world, had attacked the Celestials. The Celestials basically obliterated pretty much all the Deviants, but in the process initiated something called the Great Cataclysm, which was the sinking of Atlantis. A lot of magical artifacts and a lot of magical history on Earth in Marvel Comics was lost in the sinking of Atlantis. But people like Selene, people like Merlin, those folks actually survived the sinking of Atlantis and then took up residence in different ways within Marvel Comics. But it's just a cool little bit of history there, right? Something kind of fascinating, which all of it is to simply just say, this artifact that Blade is looking for within Wakanda has been around since before Wakanda was even a formed nation, since before anybody settled there, and before there was ever even the concept of a Black Panther. And of course, he successfully locates it. And what he ends up doing is dropping this artifact off in the middle of Central Park in New York City, because the idea is seemingly once it's activated, this kind of temple of the first blasphemy, all hell's gonna break loose. Now, what it is and what this thing is capable of is pretty dope. So what this does is this picks up with what's basically the temple of the first blasphemy within the city of New York. And a little bit of a refresher for those of you guys who don't really remember everything that happened so far, the long and short of it was that for reasons that were not fully explained, but they will be in this particular video, Blade had effectively seized control of the vampire nation from Dracula and then took control of the Darkforce energy that exists in Marvel Comics. The Darkforce energy is literally a dimension of pure darkness. Light cannot penetrate it. And so by seizing control of that, Blade blanketed the world in the Darkforce energy itself. Not that dissimilar from like when humanity blocked out the sun in the Matrix, right? It's basically the same thing. Sun doesn't get through and it allows vampires to just run amok throughout the world. Now, 99% of the tie-ins for this event were just other superheroes fighting vampires. None of the tie-ins were very interesting, but the big idea here is that with this newfound power, Blade had single-handedly taken out most everybody. The Avengers were on the ropes, Thor was incapacitated, Black Panther's been captured, and so what we do is we switch over to Doctor Strange. Now, Doctor Strange is currently in his spiritual form, the reason being because his physical body was turned into a vampire, so Clea literally pulled his spirit out of his body, and now it just roams around functioning as Doctor Strange, and they go to visit Doctor Doom. Now, here's the cool thing that goes on here, right? Victor Von Doom is the guy you go to in times like these, and the reason for that is because you kind of get this sort of back and forth between what's happening with Blade and Black Panther and those guys and what's happening with Doctor Doom, because they're both basically offering expositions. And so what you find out here is that Blade is not actually Blade. That Blade is possessed by the spirit of a being named Varnae. Now, here's the issue with this whole idea of Varnae. The most you get in this story is where Black Panther, who's still being held captive by Blade, albeit having been bitten, he's supposed to turn into a vampire. We'll find out why he doesn't. That he asks Blade who he is, and Blade says that he's actually the very first. Now, the funny thing about this is when I read this, I just read the first Black Panther, and I was like, what? They're making him a Black Panther? But no, it's just the first Black Panther. Basically like, I am the first vampire. Now, here's the cool thing. Here's why I say this is a bit of a problem, because that's all you get here, right? Varnae, and that's basically it. But Varnae actually has a really interesting history in Marvel Comics. Specifically, it goes back to a couple of different issues. Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme, issues 11 and 18. And what these stories said was that in the pre-cataclysmic era, which is to say, before the Celestials came back to Earth, obliterated the Deviants, and sunk Atlantis and almost all the world with it, that Varnae was just a sorcerer, but started dabbling in what was effectively hell magic, basically the Darkhold, and dabbling into the powers of Chthon. This turned Varnae into a vampire, and that was the very first to ever exist in Marvel. In the Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme comics, there came a point where Varnae basically stepped down and handed the mantle over to Count Dracula. And then when Doctor Strange went to war against the Vampire Nation in the old Doctor Strange comics, this basically decimated the ranks of the vampires. And it's why over the years in Marvel, if you've been reading that side, the vampire race is almost just kind of hodgepodge, right? Just sort of limping through existence and always talking about how great their race used to be at one point in time. And so with those two things combined here, what we're basically getting is the fact that Varnae is seeking to return to power, but without an actual body, it seized control of the body of Blade. And that's what really Doctor Doom explains to everybody here when he says, some years ago, Varnae's minion, Marie Laveau, prepared Blade as the host for the spirit of Varnae. Apparently, the Daywalker's unique constitution made him the ideal vessel. That attempt failed, but it would appear that a second did not. Now, this first attempt that Doctor Doom is referring to is from Blade the Vampire Hunter number 5. That was a comic back in 1994 from Ian Edgington, and basically it was a story where literally Blade was going to be turned into a vessel for Varnae. And it's one of the reasons why we've never really explained Varnae too much, because there really isn't a whole lot to go on. Varnae's not that dissimilar from like Chthon, right? Just out there always trying to find a new host body. But the fact that Blade can walk around in the daylight through a combination of having been turned into a vampire, and then actually his ability to walk around in the daylight, a result of him being bitten by Michael Morbius. Yes, that Michael Morbius from that terrible film that Sony made. That it basically makes him the perfect host, right? He can just sort of solidify his control of the Vampire Nation, have all the strengths of a vampire and none of the weaknesses in his physical form. And so in this conversation between Doctor Strange and Doctor Doom, that Strange says, like, the skies are the weakness here, right? The sun has to shine once again. We have to find a way to remove that Darkforce energy. If it's gone, then that will destroy all the vampires immediately, and those who don't die will retreat to places where the sun doesn't touch, underground, right? Probably in some castle somewhere, most likely the home of Paul at Heavy Spoilers. But the bigger point here is that Doctor Doom kind of says, yes, right? I have precautions for the Darkforce energy as well. It was only a matter of time before this happened. People have trifled with the Darkforce dimension for far too long and far too lightly for something like this to have even remotely been a surprise. And it's a cool thing because that's true. The Darkforce dimension has been used by a variety of people who can both tap into it naturally and tap into it artificially, and people have used it for a variety of purposes. It was only a matter of time before somebody came along and said, what would happen if we united all those people or forced them to use their powers against their will and cover the world in darkness? What would happen, right? And that's literally what's going on here. But the kicker is that Clea says, well, if this involves magic, then let's get to it. And the response of Victor is no, right? A great assemblage of mages to begin with, Clea Strange, a grand array of magical creatures brought together as one. And where Stephen says, I am acquainted with a great many magicians, I can assemble them, the response of Stephen is, oh, no need. I have already taken the liberty of recruiting the student body of your Strange Academy. Now, Stephen, give it to me and let us begin. Now, here's the cool thing about Strange Academy. I forgot this team existed. For those of you guys who don't know about Strange Academy, it's basically the Doctor Strange version of like the Young Avengers or New Mutants. You have like the son of Dormammu, the kid with his head on fire. It's cool. We covered the original story. It was really, really awesome. But the thing that Doctor Doom is talking about here when he says, give it to me, Stephen doesn't know what he's referencing. And Doctor Strange says, give me the power of the Sorcerer Supreme. It's the only way for me to pull this off. And so again, switching back over to Asgard itself, because one of the things to keep in mind, you've got a multifaceted approach to basically dealing with what's going on regarding Blade and everything with the Vampire Nation, that you have the Avengers themselves that are going to go back on the offensive against Blade and his forces after having just been crushed, as well as Doctor Strange and Clea working with Doctor Doom, and small little stories here and there where folks are just fighting vampires. You've also got Hunter's Moon and Tigra. Now, the reason why they matter is that Tigra was brought in to Jed McKay's Moon Knight run when he originally did it. It's a phenomenal story, we covered it, probably the best Moon Knight has been in a couple of decades in Marvel. And then you have Hunter's Moon, who was introduced as what was actually another fist of Khonshu that we didn't know about before. It was pretty fantastic. But what these two are doing is they are on the hunt for Khonshu himself. The reason being because for those of you guys who followed our coverage of that Avengers story from way back in the day, where basically Moon Knight became the Phoenix, he fought Khonshu, defeated Khonshu, and Khonshu was locked away in an Asgardian prison. And it was a way for Marvel to just remove the character of Khonshu from the landscape and allow Moon Knight to just kind of do his own thing. It was a really cool way to explore Mark Spector's character without Moon Knight lording over his head. That's what goes into Jed MacKay's run. It's really cool. And so with Hunter's Moon and them arriving here on the scene, that of course Khonshu immediately recognizes Hunter's Moon and he says, "My loving son, so kind to visit your father, but foolish I fear. I have no power to lend you in opening my cell, and you have no key for these locks." And the response of Hunter's Moon is, "You are correct, father. I have no power to open this door. I have no key, but I have brought something better." What better tool to open an Asgardian prison than an Asgardian crowbar? Because they brought the Wrecker. Now, we don't have to go super in-depth into Dirk Girthwaite. He's a cool character, but him being the Wrecker and the significance of it goes back to Thor 148 from Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in like 1966 or 67, I think. The overall gist is that he was accidentally empowered with like Asgardian magic by a woman named Carnilla who thought he was Loki. And when he fought Thor ultimately defeated him, but it turned out the magical power that he had was basically imbued in his crowbar. And that's why they brought him here, because he in turn pries this lock open, this whole cell. And what ends up happening is Khonshu finally breaks free after having been imprisoned for quite some time. Now, this is one of those moments in Marvel Comics that they do in crossovers where they kind of just decide Moon Knight's been his own thing long enough. And specifically, he died at the end of Jed MacKay's run, as awesome as it was. And so what's going to happen following this is like Moon Knight returns, right? Khonshu goes back to being the god of the moon that basically manipulates Moon Knight. And it's just business as usual for Mark Spector's character. And so what you end up doing here is you switch back over to Blade himself. And this is where things start to go sideways because Blade, who again is now possessed by Varnae, says, "I was there in old Atlantis. I was there transcribing the Darkhold, putting its bleak words to paper for the very first time. It was there that I took the first step towards becoming what I will be. And now, with the living Darkhold in my possession, with the blood of a god at hand and my place of power, I can complete the ritual." And again, the statement that's made by Black Panther here is, "I don't understand," which is a weird thing for Black Panther to say because he's like one of the smartest people in the world. But the response of Varnae is, "To become a vampire, to create the concept of the vampire, that was only the first step. The vampire was only my pupil form." And he says, "No, I was destined for something more. I was destined to be the end of all things." And he says, "Come, I am in readiness. Come to me, Darkforce." And that's when he starts absorbing all this Darkforce energy into himself. And he says, "Do you see now? I am become one with the darkness, an entire dimension of darkness. I am become the dark that consumes light, the cold that consumes warmth. I am become a vampire that consumes entire planets, entire stars. I am become the unliving Darkforce." Now, this is kind of a cool thing here because something Marvel has never done is answering the question, what would happen if a person of incredible power seized control of the entirety of the dimension of Darkforce energy and traveled out into the universe? Could they hold their own against cosmic entities that have the ability to like alter reality and things like that? A part of me wants to say, no, that's ridiculous. That would never happen. But when it comes to something like Darkforce energy, it cannot be penetrated by just standard powers, right? That cannot be done. Otherwise, you would be seeing it done by like Doctor Strange and those guys. Now, as this is going to end the way that it does, I think it flies in the face of that idea. So this whole statement by Varnae could simply just be his ego run away with itself. But what's cool is that in the midst of all this, the moon emerges. Now, the moon has not emerged ever since Khonshu has been locked away. With him being locked away, the moon has been hidden. Now, I'm sure people are going to be like, well, I mean, how does the earth continue on? And like the tides, all that kind of stuff. Who cares? It's comics. Stop stop asking questions. But what you get is this amazing monologue where Khonshu says, in the darkness and the light, that is what I am. That is what I have always been. And in this darkness, no matter where they may find themselves in the world, travelers by night see the face of Khonshu and they know they are not alone. My dead fists, stirred from their sleep, leap to battle across the world, hands filled with the silvers of my armories, warriors with no fear, no blood, no mercy, and led by my resurrected son. Here's the cool thing, man. So this is something that you learned during Jed McKay's run on Moon Knight. Traditionally in Marvel Comics, every time Mark Spector died, he would just be resurrected by Khonshu. And that was it. It was a way for Marvel to explain how his character could always come back. What you learned is there are a finite number of times in which a Moon Knight will be resurrected by Khonshu. When they're resurrected that final time, if they die, they join the armies of Khonshu's warriors in the afterlife, right? They just stay there and like somebody else becomes a new Moon Knight. That's what was supposed to happen to Mark Spector. When he died, it was his death the final time. Why didn't it happen? Because Marvel's doing Moon Knight in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and so they got to bring his character back. That's basically it, right? But at the end of the day, they were never going to permanently kill off Moon Knight anyway. And so while this is not enough, it's cool, but it gets better because what happens following this is that while Varnae is distracted, Blade basically pulls out a dagger and goes to stab somebody. Then he pulls out another blade and goes to try to attack Varnae himself. And he's basically cast off by Darkforce energy, right? It's just kind of like, okay, like what in the world are you doing here? Like, did you really believe that you could kill me like this? And he says, your blood is my own blood. Tell me, how can you possibly defy me? And the response of Black Panther is, Wakanda's been fighting vampires since forever, right? Do you really believe that our gods had abandoned us? And he says, no, the heart-shaped herb, it's been fighting my infection, healing me bit by bit. Now, this is huge. It's a huge moment in Marvel Comics, and it's very easy to dismiss, right? It's very easy to see it as a plot device, but the reality here is what Marvel is establishing, because you're going to see what happens next. What Marvel's establishing here is the abilities of the heart-shaped herb can be transferred from one person to the next, because what happens here is that where Varnae says, again, no matter, far too little and wildly too late, did you really think to kill me with that little blade? The response of Black Panther is, no, I was just removing it so that Thor might join us. And what it meant is that now Thor, with the power of the heart-shaped herb, albeit basically through Black Panther's blood, is able to hold off the infection of Thor and fight against the vampirism in his own blood. It's cool. At least that's what it seems like. But again, Thor emerging from his vampirism comes with the Avengers arriving on the scene to face off against Blade and his forces. But notice this is just a distraction, right? It's just a way to kind of keep Varnae distracted over there so he doesn't understand what's going on over here, because you switch back to Doctor Doom and his conversation with Doctor Strange. And Clea calls him out, right? She's like, you are utterly without any shame at all. You're maneuvering, your ritual, assembling the children of the Strange Academy from this school, and now this. And the response of Doom is, I alone possess the knowledge of the ritual to turn back the darkness, but I cannot enact it without the mantle of the Sorcerer Supreme. I am going to save the world, Clea, the purpose of the Sorcerer Supreme. And that's where Steven says he's right. That's the correct statement here. And so Steven simply just says, well done, Doom. You've outmaneuvered me at last. Tell me, did you engineer this entire crisis just for this moment? Now, the thing that he's talking about here, right, as you kind of go through and you have like the Avengers facing off against these guys, right, which isn't the most significant thing, but I mean, it is kind of cool to see that the thing he's talking about here is it's not the first time that Doctor Doom has orchestrated an entire conflict for the sole purpose of attaining some measure of power. And I'm not talking about, Avengers and New Avengers going into Secret Wars. Doctor Doom causing the incursions was unintentional, right? Once he realized the incursions were happening, he saw that as the lesser of two evils. The greater of those two evils was doing nothing to kill the Molecule Man and allowing the Beyonders to blow up the multiverse. If you don't know what that means, not a great big huge deal. Doom War is the story that I'm talking about, where Doctor Doom secretly orchestrated a coup d'etat in Wakanda by way of a nationalist uprising that saw T'Challa and Storm and all those characters being forced out of their leadership role. All that was done so that Dr. Doom could quietly sneak into the vault of Wakanda and steal its vibranium. That was it. That was the whole motivation behind why all that happened in the first place. And so Doom, basically observing everything that's happening out there, he tells Stephen, the Avengers have engaged Varnae and his creatures. The moon god Khonshu is dispatching his dead acolytes around the globe to battle the vampires. It will not be enough. They will lose. This is the only way to win. And so the response of Stephen is, okay, fine. You say your aims are noble. Prove it. Prove that I can trust you with this power, that I've been wrong about you. I want your oath, Victor, your solemn word that once the world is saved, you will return to me what is mine. The response of Victor, you have my word, the word of Doom. Now, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar about Dr. Doom, you're just kind of like, well, I mean, of course he's going to go back on his word. No, man, when Dr. Doom gives his word, he gives you his word. But there's a caveat here. So you're not totally off, because Stephen Strange hands over the power of the Sorcerer Supreme to Victor Von Doom. And so in response to this, while everything's going nuts, you jump over to Bloodline and Miles Morales. Now, Bloodline and Miles were the other part of this story, in the sense that it kind of led into it to a degree. Bloodline is the biological daughter of Blade, and he initially hid her away so that nobody would ever know she existed, right? But once vampires started going after her, that Blade realized that she was going to be in danger, so he took her under his wing and trained her to be a vampire killer. But Miles kind of got tossed into them when basically there was a kind of team up between Blade and Bloodline and Miles. And so what happens is that with Bloodline being the biological daughter of Blade, she is seemingly, quote unquote, the only one who can defeat him. Now, it's not in a literal sense, it's really more metaphorical and ceremonial, the idea that she is the means by which all of this will end. And so what happens is that while Blade has all the Avengers basically defeated, you think they'd be smart enough than just not jump headlong into this, that Thor has been without his hammer this entire time. And Thor recalls the hammer to himself. So the entire fight between Blade and the Avengers takes place in the time that Thor's hammer is returning to him. And while the hammer does show up with enough time to be able to allow Thor to jump back on the offensive, it's not enough, right? It is not enough to undo any of this. It does allow Moon Knight to show up here, and Moon Knight's really the one that saves the day because he starts taking out the forces of Blade left and right. Again, it's not enough to destroy them all, but it is enough to hold off their imminent destruction. But again, all of them are ensnared by Blade using his Darkforce energy. And it's like, you guys can't win. I don't know what would have led you to believe that you could, and it's adorable that you did. But the reality here is you are all going to lose. And he says, I had only one weakness, Avengers, the girl, the bloodline, and she's not here. But then she shows up out of nowhere and just stabs her father, right? But the reality here is because he's so immensely possessed by Varnae, it doesn't really make much of a difference. And then Miles jumps in and Miles stabs him as well. The cool thing here is that it's not enough to destroy him, but it is enough to break Varnae's concentration. And that's when Dr. Doom is now, right? He's literally Goku from Dragon Ball Z, right? Now's your chance! And just unloads all this magical energy and strikes at the Darkforce energy. That alongside the Scarlet Witch who shows up with the other magical members of Marvel's universe basically start laying waste to Varnae. And when they do, with the Darkforce energy gone, and because Varnae is a traditional vampire, Varnae is defeated like that, right? That's basically it. Because the defeat of Varnae is not the point of this story. It is not the point of this story, ladies and gentlemen, because yes, they win. The Darkforce energy is cast off. The sun returns. Vampires are actually a little bit different now. One of the cool things that comes out of it is that vampires actually have the ability to walk around in the sun now, which who knows how that's going to play out. And that's going to be a really exciting part of the story. The important thing that comes out of the ending of this is Doctor Strange and Dr. Doom, because they have a conversation where Stephen says, that was an incredible piece of magic, Victor. And he says, now your promise, your oath, return to me the mantle of the Sorcerer Supreme. And Doom just kind of looks at him for a second. And Stephen says, your oath, Victor. And the response of Dr. Doom, yes, It's my oath to surrender the office of Sorcerer Supreme back to you once I saved the world. And I have only just begun, Stephen. Doom does nothing halfway. And he just like whisks away Stephen Strange's non-corporeal essence and he says, now, let me show you what it means to save the world. Because for those of you guys who have not been reading the news from Marvel Comics, come November, it's one world under Doom. Doom seizes control of the world with his power of the Sorcerer Supreme. At least that seems to be the case. And be ready. With Robert Downey Jr. coming out as Dr. Doom in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you're going to see a boatload of stories that involve his characters. And I am here for it. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.